The seeds of a different life. Daniel Green was born with a gentle heart and a relentless spirit. Diagnosed with Down syndrome at birth, he grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. The town had its charms, but its people often carried silent assumptions. They whispered about what Daniel might never accomplish, what limitations he would face, and how far he could go in life. Yet Daniel approached his world with a quiet determination, content to let his actions speak louder than the doubts surrounding him. From an early age, Daniel understood that he was different. But different never meant less to him. It simply meant unique. With the guidance of his loving parents, Daniel learned to navigate a world that wasn't always kind. His father, a retired mechanic, and his mother, a homemaker, instilled in him values of perseverance and kindness. They taught him to focus on what he could do rather than dwell on what others thought he couldn't. Daniel was meticulous and reliable, traits that served him well in his job at a small local library. Though he worked in the background shelving books and tidying up, he found joy in the routine. Books became his companions, their pages opening windows to worlds he might never visit but could vividly imagine. In those quiet hours, Daniel dreamed of a life that transcended the whispers of others. One such dream found a spark the day he met Sarah Thompson. Sarah was a vibrant young teacher who had recently moved to town. Their first meeting was at a community art class Daniel volunteered for, helping set up chairs and arrange supplies. Sarah arrived late, juggling a mountain of art materials in her arms. "Need a hand?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but steady. Sarah glanced at him and smiled. "That would be great. Thanks." Daniel carefully took some of the supplies from her, his steady hands making light work of what had seemed precarious moments earlier. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's warmth and easy laughter drew Daniel out of his shell. She was the first person in a long time who treated him as an equal, engaging him in conversations that made him feel seen. She asked about his hobbies, laughed at his dry humor, and shared stories about her students with an enthusiasm that was contagious. One evening, after the class had ended, they walked home together under a blanket of stars. "You know," Sarah said, "you're one of the kindest people I've met here. You're thoughtful in ways most people aren't." Daniel hesitated, unsure how to respond. I just try to help. And that's more than enough," she said, her smile lighting up the night. Their relationship blossomed quietly but fiercely, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. It wasn't without its challenges, though. Sarah's family and friends questioned her choice. They wondered aloud if Daniel, with his condition, could truly be the partner she deserved. But Sarah was resolute. "Daniel loves with his whole heart," she told her mother one evening. "And that's all I've ever wanted." When Sarah became pregnant, their joy was immeasurable. Daniel threw himself into preparing for their baby with the same meticulousness that defined his life. He painted the nursery in soft, calming hues, assembled furniture with precision, and read every parenting book he could find. "I want them to have everything," he told Sarah one night, his hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "I want them to know they're loved." "And they will," Sarah assured him, her voice filled with confidence, "because they'll have you as their dad." But life, as it often does, had its own plans. Late in her pregnancy, complications arose. Sarah was placed on strict bed rest, leaving Daniel to juggle work, household duties, and preparing for their child. He never once complained, pouring every ounce of himself into caring for Sarah and the baby they were eagerly awaiting. "Promise me," Sarah said one night, her voice frail but determined, "that no matter what happens, you'll give our child the best life possible." "Don't talk like that," Daniel replied, his voice trembling. "We'll be fine. All three of us." But fate dealt a cruel hand. Sarah passed away during childbirth, leaving Daniel to navigate a world without her while raising their son, Ethan, alone. A hospital room, once filled with the promise of new life, now carried the weight of unbearable loss. As Daniel held his newborn son for the first time, tears streamed down his face. I don't know how to do this without you, Sarah, he whispered, his voice breaking. But I'll try. For him. For you. The days that followed were a whirlwind of grief and responsibility. Well-meaning friends and family offered their support, some suggesting that Daniel might not be able to raise Ethan on his own. "You've got a good heart, Daniel," his brother said gently. "But maybe someone else could." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady for the first time in days. "He's my son. Sarah believed in me, and I won't let her down." That first night alone with Ethan was a test of everything Daniel had. The baby cried incessantly, and Daniel, overwhelmed and sleep-deprived, tried everything. Rocking, singing, even calling a neighbor for advice. When Ethan finally fell asleep in his arms, Daniel sat on the couch, exhausted but resolute. "You're so small," he murmured, his voice filled with wonder and determination. "But I'll do my best, Ethan. I promise." Thus began Daniel's journey as a single father. It was a path fraught with challenges, but one he faced with an unwavering love that would shape Ethan's life in ways neither of them could yet imagine. This was just the beginning of a story that would test the limits of devotion, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. A father's determination. The early years of Ethan's life were a whirlwind for Daniel Green, a journey that tested him in ways he could never have imagined. From the moment Ethan arrived home from the hospital, Daniel's life became a balancing act. He was a single father navigating a world that doubted his capabilities, yet every morning he rose with a singular purpose: to give Ethan the best life he could. Daniel's first hurdle was finding a job that would allow him to balance work and parenting. He had been working at the local library, but the rigid hours made it impossible to care for Ethan properly. After much thought, he resigned with a heavy heart and began searching for a position closer to home with more flexibility. Weeks turned into a month, and the savings Sarah had left behind began to dwindle. But just as Daniel's hopes started to falter, an opportunity arose: a position at a nearby diner. The diner wasn't glamorous. It was a noisy, bustling place with the scent of fried food hanging perpetually in the air. But it offered something Daniel desperately needed: evening hours that allowed him to spend the day with Ethan. On his first day, Daniel felt a mix of nerves and determination. His new manager, Louise, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, gave him a once-over and said, "We don't need perfection here, Daniel, just hard work. Can you manage that?" Daniel nodded. "I can manage." The early days at the diner were grueling. The work was fast-paced, and the clatter of plates and orders being shouted across the kitchen made his head spin. He burned his hand twice on the fryer and accidentally dropped a tray of dishes during a busy dinner rush. Louise wasn't one to mince words. "Daniel," she said sternly, "you've got to focus. Mistakes slow us all down." "I'll do better," Daniel promised, his face flushing with embarrassment. And he did. Each night after putting Ethan to bed, Daniel stayed up watching cooking tutorials and studying the menu, determined to memorize every dish. Slowly but surely, he found his rhythm. His coworkers, initially skeptical, began to notice his dedication. "He's a hard worker," one of them remarked to Louise after a particularly busy shift. "Doesn't quit, no matter how tough it gets." "Yeah," Louise agreed, watching Daniel wipe down the counter with meticulous care. "He's got heart." Daniel's dedication to his job was matched only by his devotion to Ethan. Their tiny apartment became a haven of love and laughter. Though money was tight, Daniel made sure Ethan never felt the strain. He built a routine for them. Mornings were spent at the park. Afternoons were for story time and crafts, and evenings were sacred family time. One day, as they sat on the floor coloring, Ethan held up a picture of a house with a big tree in the yard. "Look, Daddy, that's us." Daniel beamed. "That's a great house, Ethan. You're quite the artist." "Will we ever have a house like that?" Ethan asked innocently, his wide eyes filled with hope. Daniel's heart clenched. "Maybe someday," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair. But even if we don't, as long as we have each other, we'll always have a home." Despite his best efforts, Daniel faced criticism from others who doubted his ability to parent. Some of the daycare workers gave him questioning looks when he dropped Ethan off, their skepticism barely concealed. One day, a neighbor, Mrs. Carter, pulled him aside. "Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "have you thought about what's best for Ethan? Maybe it would be easier if someone else, helped." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Ethan is my son. I'm doing my best, and that's enough." Mrs. Carter sighed, clearly unconvinced, but Daniel refused to let her words linger. He had made a promise to Sarah, and he intended to keep it. Over time, Daniel's steadfast love for Ethan began to shine through to those around him. At the daycare, Ethan thrived. He was a cheerful, curious child, always eager to learn. Miss Linda, one of the workers, noticed the bond between father and son. "You're doing a great job, Daniel," she said one day as he picked Ethan up. "Ethan talks about you all the time. He's lucky to have you." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "I'm the lucky one." But as Ethan grew, so did the challenges. By the time he was 5, he started asking questions that Daniel struggled to answer. One evening, as they sat on the couch reading a bedtime story, Ethan looked up at him and asked, "Daddy, why don't I have a mommy like the other kids?" Daniel froze, the words catching in his throat. He set the book down and pulled Ethan into his lap. "Your mommy loved you very much, Ethan," he said softly. "She wanted to be here, but sometimes life doesn't go the way we want. But you know what?" "What?" Ethan asked, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "She's always with us," Daniel said, placing a hand over Ethan's heart. "Right here. And she's so proud of you, just like I am." Ethan nodded solemnly, resting his head on Daniel's chest. "I miss her even though I didn't know her." "I miss her too," Daniel whispered, holding his son tightly. Through the years, Ethan became Daniel's reason for everything. Every long shift at the diner, every penny saved, and every sleepless night was for Ethan. Though their life was far from easy, it was filled with love. Daniel's unwavering commitment to his son became a quiet but powerful testament to the strength of a parent's love. As Ethan approached his school years, Daniel knew he needed to prepare for the challenges ahead. The whispers and doubts that had followed him his entire life wouldn't go away, and now they might extend to Ethan. But Daniel was determined to shield his son from the negativity that had so often been directed at him. One night, as Ethan slept, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, a notebook open in front of him. Inside were his plans for Ethan's future, saving for school supplies, budgeting for extracurricular activities, and even ideas for how to support Ethan's dreams, whatever they might be. He wrote at the top of the page, "For Ethan, whatever it takes." The road ahead would be difficult, but Daniel wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges all his life, and this was just another chapter. For Ethan, he would move mountains, defy expectations, and silence the whispers. After all, love was the strongest foundation he could build on, and his love for Ethan was unshakable. What Daniel didn't know was just how far that love would carry them, and how much Ethan would grow to honor the man who had given him everything. The echoes of doubt. Ethan Green was 8 years old when the whispers started to reach him. Until then, his world had been a cocoon of love, shielded by his father's tireless devotion. He was too young to understand the complexities of the world or the judgments people often made. But the older he got, the more he noticed. Whispers on the playground, sidelong glances at parent-teacher conferences, and quiet murmurs from neighbors reached his ears. "Isn't his dad the one who works at the diner? Such a shame. He's special, isn't he? They're doing okay, I suppose, but for how long?" At first, Ethan didn't understand why people spoke about his father in hushed tones, as though he were a secret best left unmentioned. To Ethan, Daniel was everything a father should be: loving, patient, and present. But as he grew older, the weight of the world's assumptions began to seep into Ethan's life, and it became harder to ignore. The first time Ethan felt the sting of shame, it came from a simple question. During a class assignment, the teacher asked the students to write about their families. Ethan proudly wrote about his dad, describing him as the kindest, smartest, and funniest person in the world. He added that his dad worked hard at the diner and always made time to read bedtime stories or draw with him. When the teacher read the essays aloud, a boy named Ryan snickered. "Your dad flips burgers. That's not a real job." Ethan's cheeks burned. He didn't know what to say. The teacher, sensing the tension, moved on quickly, but the damage was done. That night, Ethan barely touched his dinner. Daniel noticed. "You okay, buddy?" Daniel asked, setting down his fork. Ethan hesitated. "Dad, do you like working at the diner?" Daniel paused, surprised by the question. "I like that it helps me take care of you," he said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding his father's gaze. "No reason." Daniel studied his son's face, sensing there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached across the table and ruffled Ethan's hair. "You know, it doesn't matter what job I have. What matters is that I'm here for you." Ethan nodded, but the lingering doubt stayed with him. The burden of fitting in. As the years passed, Ethan began to struggle with the duality of his feelings. On one hand, he adored his father. Daniel's love was a constant in his life, unwavering and pure. But on the other hand, Ethan started noticing how different their family was from others. His friends had parents who were doctors, lawyers, or teachers. Their homes were larger, their vacations longer, and their lives seemed smoother. One day during recess, a group of boys approached Ethan. Ryan, the same boy who had mocked his father years ago, was at the center. "Hey, Ethan," Ryan said with a sly grin. "Is it true your dad has Down syndrome?" Ethan froze. He knew his father had Down syndrome, but he had never thought of it as something to be ashamed of. The way Ryan said it, though, made it sound like a flaw, something to hide. "So what if he does?" Ethan said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Ryan shrugged. "I don't know. Just seems weird, that's all. Bet he can't even help you with your homework." The group laughed, and Ethan felt a hot wave of anger and humiliation wash over him. He clenched his fists, but before he could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. That evening, Ethan was unusually quiet again. Daniel noticed but didn't press until they were reading a bedtime story. Halfway through the book, Ethan blurted out, "Dad, why are you different?" Daniel closed the book and looked at his son. "What do you mean, Ethan? Why are you special? Like, why do people talk about you like you're not like other dads?" Daniel's heart ached at the question, but he kept his voice steady. "Well, I was born with something called Down syndrome. It means my brain works a little differently than most people's, but it doesn't mean I love you any less or that I can't take care of you." "Do people make fun of you?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "Sometimes," Daniel admitted, "but it doesn't matter what they say. What matters is how we treat each other, and Ethan, you and me. We're a team." Ethan nodded, but the conversation left him feeling heavy. A test of resilience. The following week, the school announced a parent-student talent show. Ethan loved performing and was eager to sign up, but when he brought the form home, he hesitated. He knew Daniel would want to participate, and the thought filled Ethan with a mix of excitement and dread. What if his classmates laughed at his dad? What if Ryan said something cruel? "Hey, what's that?" Daniel asked, noticing the paper on the counter. "It's a talent show," Ethan mumbled. "You don't have to come." "Are you kidding?" Daniel said, his face lighting up. "We'd be the best team there." Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, maybe." Over the next few days, they practiced their act, a comedy sketch that Daniel had come up with. It was silly and fun, filled with jokes that made Ethan laugh until his sides hurt. But as the show approached, Ethan's anxiety grew. On the night of the talent show, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Ethan peeked out from behind the curtain, spotting Ryan and his friends in the audience. His stomach churned. "Ready, buddy?" Daniel asked, adjusting his body. Ethan hesitated. "What if they laugh at us, Dad?" Daniel knelt down to his son's level. "Let them laugh. We're here to have fun, right? And if they laugh, maybe it's because we're funny." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. As their names were called, they stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding, but Ethan focused on his father, who started their act with an exaggerated bow. To Ethan's surprise, the audience laughed, genuine, warm laughter. By the end of their performance, the applause was thunderous. Ethan felt a swell of pride as he looked at his father, who was grinning from ear to ear. After the show, several parents came up to Daniel, praising his performance. "You're a natural comedian," one of them said. Ethan smiled for the first time in days. In that moment, he realized something. His father's differences didn't make him less. They made him extraordinary. A shifting perspective. The talent show became a turning point for Ethan. While he still struggled with the pressures of fitting in, he began to see his father through a new lens. Daniel wasn't just different. He was resilient, loving, and endlessly supportive. Slowly, Ethan started to embrace their unique bond, finding strength in the love that had always been there. Though the whispers didn't stop entirely, Ethan learned to drown them out with the voice that mattered most, his father's. And as they continued their journey together, Ethan began to understand that the only opinions that truly mattered were their own. Together, they were unstoppable, a testament to the unbreakable bond between a father and son. The growing distance. By the time Ethan Green entered middle school, the once close bond he shared with his father, Daniel, began to stretch under the weight of adolescence. Like many teenagers, Ethan found himself yearning to fit in, to blend seamlessly with his peers. Yet his father's uniqueness, a source of pride in his early years, now felt like a glaring spotlight in a world where standing out could be brutal. At school, Ethan excelled academically. He was bright, curious, and eager to learn. Teachers often praised him for his diligence, and his classmates envied his sharp mind. But beneath his success, Ethan felt a growing sense of unease. The whispers about his father, the subtle jabs, and the teasing began to take a toll. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his studies, the weight of those comments lingered in the back of his mind. "Your dad works at a diner, right?" Ryan, a boy who seemed to take joy in pointing out everyone's flaws, asked one day during lunch. "Do you get free burgers or something?" Ethan forced a laugh, shrugging. "Yeah, sometimes," he said, trying to downplay the conversation. But Ryan wasn't finished. "Must be weird, though. My dad's a lawyer. What's it like having a dad who flips burgers?" The laughter that followed stung more than Ethan cared to admit. He clenched his jaw and stared at his tray, wishing he could disappear. When he got home that evening, Daniel greeted him with his usual warmth. "Hey, buddy. How was school?" Daniel asked, his eyes lighting up as Ethan walked through the door. "Fine," Ethan mumbled, heading straight to his room. Daniel frowned, sensing something was wrong but unsure how to address it. He decided to give Ethan space, hoping he'd come around on his own. But the distance only grew. Cracks in the foundation. The changes were subtle at first. Ethan began avoiding school events where parents were invited. When the annual parent-student picnic was announced, Ethan handed Daniel the flyer reluctantly. "We don't have to go," Ethan said quickly. "It's not a big deal." Daniel's face fell slightly. "But I thought we could go together. We always have fun at these things." "Yeah, but I don't know. It's probably boring," Ethan replied, avoiding his father's gaze. Daniel nodded, though the hurt in his eyes was evident. "Okay, buddy, if you're sure." On the day of the picnic, Ethan found himself wishing he had just stayed home. As he sat with his classmates, Ryan approached, a sly grin on his face. "Where's your dad?" Ryan asked loudly. didn't want to bring him along. Ethan's stomach churned. "He's busy," he lied. Ryan smirked. "Busy making fries, huh?" The other kids laughed, and Ethan's cheeks burned with embarrassment. He spent the rest of the picnic trying to avoid their teasing, but the damage was done. That evening, when Daniel asked how the picnic went, Ethan gave a curt, "It was fine," before retreating to his room. The once open conversations they shared became increasingly rare. Daniel tried to bridge the gap, but Ethan's answers were short, his smiles forced. He spent more time with his friends, coming home later and later, and when he was home, he stayed in his room, his door shut tight. A breaking point. One evening, Daniel suggested chaperoning a school dance. He thought it might be a way to reconnect with Ethan, to show him he was still involved in his life. Ethan froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You want to chaperone?" "Yeah," Daniel said enthusiastically. "I can help with decorations or serve snacks." Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, Dad. It's fine. You don't need to." "Why not?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. "I think it'd be fun." "You don't get it," Ethan snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "You don't belong there, okay?" Daniel blinked, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "I don't belong?" he asked softly. "I mean, I don't know," Ethan mumbled, his anger fading into guilt. "People might say stuff." Daniel's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of hurt in his father's eyes. "I didn't know I embarrassed you," Daniel said quietly, pushing his chair back. "I'm sorry, Ethan." As Daniel walked away, Ethan sat frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. He wanted to apologize, to explain that it wasn't about embarrassment, but about the cruel world they lived in. But the words wouldn't come. A glimmer of understanding. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan wandered into the kitchen. He found Daniel sitting at the table, a photo album open in front of him. The pages were filled with pictures of Ethan as a baby, of Sarah's bright smile, and of Daniel holding Ethan with an expression of pure love. "Dad?" Ethan said hesitantly. Daniel looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but gentle. "Hey, buddy." "Couldn't sleep." Ethan shook his head and sat across from him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean what I said." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's okay, Ethan. I know it's hard for you. Growing up, dealing with everything. It's not easy." "You don't embarrass me," Ethan said, his throat tight. I hate how people talk about you. They don't understand how amazing you are." Daniel reached across the table, placing a hand on Ethan's. "People will always talk, Ethan, but what matters is what we think of ourselves. And I'm proud of who I am, just like I'm proud of you." Ethan nodded, tears brimming in his eyes. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, buddy," Daniel said, pulling him into a hug. Rebuilding the bond. The conversation marked the beginning of a slow but steady rebuilding of their bond. Ethan started to see his father not through the lens of others' judgments, but through the love and sacrifices that had defined their life together. While the distance between them hadn't vanished entirely, it no longer felt insurmountable. Ethan realized that his father's strength lay not in conforming to societal norms, but in defying them with grace and humility. Daniel had faced the world's doubts head-on, and emerged not just as a capable father, but as a source of unwavering love and resilience. And though Ethan still struggled with the pressures of adolescence, he began to carry his father's lessons with him. A quiet strength, a refusal to be defined by others, and a love that could withstand any storm. A sacrifice beyond measure. The years of middle school gave way to high school, bringing new challenges and milestones for Ethan Green. Now a teenager, he was growing into a confident, ambitious young man. His father's sacrifices had laid the foundation for his success, but as Ethan stepped further into the world, the gap between their experiences began to widen. Ethan's high school was larger and more competitive than his middle school, filled with students whose parents were doctors, engineers, or business owners. Conversations often revolved around family vacations, internships, and plans for the future. While Ethan was thriving academically and socially, he couldn't help but feel the unspoken divide when his friends asked about his father. "What does your dad do?" a classmate, Jenna, asked during lunch one day. Ethan hesitated. "He works at a diner," he said, his tone neutral. "Oh," Jenna replied, her voice tinged with surprise. "That's cool." Ethan forced a smile, but the moment left him feeling unsettled. It wasn't that he was ashamed of his father. He admired Daniel's resilience and love more than anything. But he also knew how people could judge, and he hated the thought of anyone looking down on the man who had given up so much for him. The cost of a dream. Ethan had always been drawn to science, particularly biology. By his junior year, he had decided he wanted to become a doctor. It was a lofty goal, one that required years of education and financial resources they didn't have. Still, Daniel's unwavering belief in Ethan gave him the courage to pursue it. One evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, a stack of college brochures spread out in front of him. Daniel walked in, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Planning your future, huh?" Daniel said with a smile. "Yeah," Ethan replied, glancing up. "But med school is expensive, Dad." "Like, really expensive." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "We'll figure it out, Ethan. Don't worry about the money." "But I do worry," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You've already given up so much for me. I don't want to ask for more." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Ethan, being your dad is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I've never seen it as giving something up. I see it as investing in you. And if med school is your dream, I'll do whatever it takes to help you get there." Ethan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He didn't know how to express the depth of his gratitude, so he simply said, "Thanks, Dad." The weight of sacrifice. True to his word, Daniel began working longer hours at the diner. He took on double shifts, often staying late to cover for others. His coworkers worried about him. "Daniel, you're going to burn yourself out," Louise, the manager, said one night as he stayed late to clean the kitchen. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, his voice steady but tired. "Ethan needs this." Louise shook her head but didn't argue. She had seen the same determination in Daniel for years. He was a man who refused to quit, no matter how hard things got. At home, Ethan began to notice the toll it was taking. Daniel's hands trembled slightly when he handed Ethan a plate of food. His steps were slower, his shoulders more slumped. One evening, Ethan found him asleep at the kitchen table, his head resting on a pile of unopened bills. "Dad," Ethan said softly, shaking him awake. "Go to bed." Daniel blinked, startled. "I'm fine," he mumbled, sitting up straight. "No, you're not," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Daniel smiled weakly. "It's worth it for you, Ethan." But Ethan wasn't so sure. He began to question whether his dreams were worth the cost of his father's health. A moment of crisis. The breaking point came one afternoon when Ethan came home from school to find Daniel lying on the floor near the kitchen. Panic surged through him as he rushed to his father's side. "Dad, what happened?" Ethan cried, shaking him gently. Daniel groaned, his face pale. "Just dizzy," he muttered. "Too tired." Ethan grabbed his phone and called an ambulance, his hand shaking as he relayed their address. The minutes felt like hours as he waited, holding Daniel's hand and fighting back tears. At the hospital, the doctor explained that Daniel was severely dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion. "He's been pushing his body too hard," the doctor said. "He needs rest, proper nutrition, and less stress." Ethan sat by Daniel's bedside that night, guilt gnawing at him. He thought about the countless hours his father had worked, the meals he had skipped, and the sacrifices he had made. Also, Ethan could have a chance at a better future. When Daniel finally woke, His voice was weak but steady. "Hey, buddy," he said, managing a small smile. "Hey, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You scared me." "I'm sorry," Daniel said. "I just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed." "You've already given me everything," Ethan said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't need you to work yourself to death for me." Daniel reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on Ethan's. "Ethan, you're my everything. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." A new understanding. The hospital scare forced Ethan to reevaluate his priorities. He realized that his father's love and sacrifices were more valuable than any dream he could chase. Over the next few weeks, he began taking on more responsibilities at home, helping with chores and finding ways to support his father. He also threw himself into his studies with renewed determination, not just for himself but for Daniel. He wanted to prove that his father's sacrifices weren't in vain. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Ethan turned to Daniel and said, "I'm going to make you proud, Dad. I promise." Daniel smiled, his eyes brimming with pride. "You already have, Ethan. Every single day." The bond between them, once strained by the weight of life's challenges, was stronger than ever. And as Ethan continued his journey toward becoming a doctor, he carried his father's love and sacrifices with him, knowing that they were the foundation of everything he hoped to achieve. Repaying a lifetime of love. Years passed, and Ethan Green transformed from a bright-eyed high school student to a dedicated medical student on the cusp of graduation. He had come a long way, but he never forgot the sacrifices his father, Daniel, made to get him there. Every sleepless night, every dollar stretched, and every ounce of love Daniel poured into Ethan's life had been the bedrock of his success. As Ethan prepared for his final year of medical school, Daniel's health began to decline. The years of hard work and self-neglect were catching up with him. His hands, once steady enough to meticulously flip burgers and build Ethan's childhood toys, trembled more noticeably now. His energy waned, and even the smallest tasks seemed to leave him exhausted. Ethan, now fully aware of the price his father had paid, vowed to repay him in a way that would honor the lifetime of love and sacrifice he had been given. The graduation that meant everything. The day of Ethan's medical school graduation was one of the proudest moments of Daniel's life. Though his body was frail, his spirit was unshaken. He insisted on attending, even against the advice of his doctor. Ethan had rented a wheelchair for Daniel to make it easier for him to navigate the campus, but Daniel resisted. "I'll walk," Daniel said, his tone resolute. "Dad, you don't have to push yourself," Ethan replied gently. "You've done more than enough." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "Watching you graduate is worth every step." The ceremony was grand, with hundreds of students donning their caps and gowns. But to Daniel, Ethan was the only person who mattered. As Ethan's name was called, and he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he paused, looking out into the crowd until he found Daniel. Lifting the diploma high, Ethan made sure his father could see it. "This is for you, Dad," Ethan mouthed. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He clapped as loudly as his hands would allow, his heart swelling with pride. A new chapter. After graduation, Ethan returned home, determined to take care of Daniel the way his father had always cared for him. He accepted a residency at a hospital close to their town, ensuring he could be there for his father while continuing his medical training. Their modest apartment became a hub of care and gratitude. Ethan cooked meals, cleaned, and made sure Daniel took his medication on time. He also made an effort to spend quality time with his father, bringing back some of the simple joys they had shared when Ethan was a child. "Remember when we used to color together?" Ethan asked one evening, pulling out a set of colored pencils and paper. Daniel chuckled, his voice weaker but full of warmth. "You always stayed inside the lines. I was the messy one." "Well," Ethan said, smiling, "you taught me that sometimes coloring outside the lines makes life more interesting." As they sat together, coloring and reminiscing, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Taking care of his father wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. A dream fulfilled. Though Daniel's health continued to decline, his spirit remained strong. Ethan often shared stories from his days at the hospital, regaling his father with tales of patients and procedures. Daniel listened intently, his eyes lighting up with pride every time Ethan mentioned how he had helped someone. One evening, as Ethan prepared dinner, Daniel spoke up. "You're doing it, Ethan," he said softly. "You're making a difference. That's all I ever wanted for you." Ethan turned, his eyes brimming with emotion. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Dad. Everything I am is because of you." Daniel smiled. "You're wrong about that. You've always had it in you. I just gave you a little push." The ultimate tribute. When Ethan completed his residency and became a full-fledged doctor, he decided it was time to honor his father in a way that would leave a lasting legacy. Using his savings and support from a few close friends, Ethan spearheaded a project to open a community health clinic in their town. The clinic would provide affordable care to families in need, a testament to the values of kindness and selflessness Daniel had instilled in him. He named it the Daniel Green Community Health Center, unveiling the name at a small ceremony attended by friends, neighbors, and even some of Daniel's old coworkers from the diner. Daniel, now confined to a wheelchair, looked at the sign with tears streaming down his face. "You named it after me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Of course," Ethan replied, kneeling beside him. "You're the reason this is possible. Every person we help here will know it's because of you." Daniel reached out, gripping Ethan's hand tightly. "You've given me more than I ever could have asked for, Ethan." "No, Dad," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "You're the one who gave me everything. This is just my way of saying thank you." The enduring bond. In the months that followed, the clinic became a beacon of hope for the community. Ethan poured his heart into his work, treating each patient with the same compassion and care his father had shown him throughout his life. Daniel visited the clinic often, proud to see the difference his son was making. Though Daniel's health continued to decline, he lived to see the fruits of his love and sacrifice blossom in ways he had never imagined. In his final days, he told Ethan, "I couldn't have asked for a better life or a better son." When Daniel passed, Ethan felt an ache unlike anything he had ever known. But amidst his grief was a profound sense of gratitude. His father's legacy lived on in every patient he treated, every life he touched, and every act of kindness inspired by the lessons Daniel had taught him. And though Daniel was gone, Ethan carried him in his heart, knowing that the bond they shared was unbreakable, a testament to the enduring power of love and sacrifice. The legacy of love. The loss of Daniel Green marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in Ethan's life, but it also signaled the beginning of a new one. At Daniel's funeral, the church was filled with people whose lives he had quietly touched, neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers who had once received his kindness in fleeting but impactful moments. Ethan stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges as he looked out over the crowd. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of his grief and love. "My father wasn't a man of grand gestures," Ethan began, his voice echoing in the silent room. "He didn't seek recognition or praise. But what he gave to me, and to so many others, was more valuable than anything money could buy. He gave his love, his time, and his unwavering belief in the people he cared about. He taught me that success isn't measured by wealth or titles, but by the lives you touch and the kindness you leave behind. I stand here today not just as his son, but as someone shaped entirely by his sacrifices and his love. Everything I am, everything I'll ever achieve, is because of him." Ethan paused, glancing at the casket adorned with simple white lilies, Daniel's favorite flower. "Dad, you gave me everything. I only hope I can honor you by giving back even a fraction of what you gave to me." Building a legacy. In the months following Daniel's passing, Ethan poured himself into his work at the Daniel Green Community Health Center. The clinic became more than a workplace. It was a living tribute to his father's legacy. Ethan expanded its services, adding mental health counseling and free parenting workshops, inspired by the values Daniel had lived by. The community rallied around the clinic, donating time, resources, and even funds to ensure it continued to thrive. Ethan often found himself sharing his father's story with patients and volunteers, reminding them that love and resilience could overcome even the greatest challenges. One evening, a young boy came into the clinic with his mother. The boy clung to her leg, shy and nervous. Ethan knelt down to his level, a warm smile on his face. "Hey there," Ethan said gently. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy whispered. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a bittersweet smile spreading across his face. "That's a great name. You know, my dad's name was Daniel too." The boy's eyes lit up. "Really? Was he nice?" "The nicest person I've ever known," Ethan said, his voice soft. "And he'd think you're pretty great too." Finding peace. As the years went by, Ethan continued to honor his father's memory, not just through the clinic, but in the way he lived his life. He carried Daniel's lessons with him in every decision he made, every patient he treated, and every challenge he faced. One evening, Ethan sat in the small living room of their apartment, now filled with framed photographs and mementos of his father. The old photo album Daniel had once held was on the coffee table, its pages worn but cherished. Ethan flipped through it, his fingers tracing the images of his childhood. His father holding him as a baby, their first trip to the park, the silly talent show they performed together. As he closed the album, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. Daniel's physical presence might be gone, but his love and lessons were eternal. They lived on in Ethan's actions, in the lives he touched, and in the stories he would one day tell his own children. Ethan looked out the window at the stars, remembering the nights he and his father used to walk home from the community center, talking about dreams and possibilities. "Thank you, Dad," Ethan whispered into the quiet night, "for everything. I'll keep making you proud." A full circle. Years later, Ethan stood in the bustling lobby of the Daniel Green Community Health Center, now a thriving institution serving thousands of families every year. A plaque near the entrance bore Daniel's name and a simple inscription, "A life of love, sacrifice, and resilience." Ethan, now a seasoned doctor and community leader, watched as a father walked in with his young son. The boy, no older than 5, held his father's hand tightly, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you Dr. Green?" the man asked. Ethan smiled. "That's me. I've heard about your clinic. People say it's a place where everyone feels cared for," the man said. "Thank you for creating this." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "It's all thanks to my dad," he said. "He taught me everything I know about caring for others." As the father and son moved on, Ethan turned back to his work, feeling Daniel's presence in every corner of the clinic, in every life it touched. And as he carried on, he knew his father's legacy would continue to ripple outward, a testament to the enduring power of love and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. In that moment, Ethan realized the truth he had always known but could now fully embrace. The greatest gift his father had ever given him wasn't just his love. It was the strength to carry that love forward, shaping the world one act of kindness at a time.